Okay, I have 1 minute past the hour, so we're going to get started. This session is being recorded. I know lots of people ask me that. So good afternoon. This is Ainsley Keller. I manage our North American operation for SK Global. See a lot of friendly faces on the line today, so thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. This is one of the episodes in our summer webinar series. If you've been a part of this for quite some time, then you've heard this spiel before, but hang in there with me. If you are new to our summer webinar series, we have been doing these events almost every Thursday since the middle of May. And as you can see on this slide, we've covered a lot of different topics. If you go to sksoft.com/events, you can sign up to see any of our past events on demand. At the end of August, we did our first partner feature where we were featuring another premier ISV in the Microsoft space, and that was our friends at Flint Fox and their trade revenue management solution. And we got a lot of great feedback from that. And our next session, middle of September, will be featuring another top partner ISV in the channel, which is Elevate HR. So I'm hoping that you all will join us for the rest of our September schedule. And today, of course, we're going to be covering a peek inside of what we call the SK Global Bank Consult. So again, if you go to our website and you click on the events button at the top, or you go to sksoft.com/events, you can get any of the on-demand recordings of these webinars, and you can also register for the rest of the events that we have in September. If you see anything today that causes questions, that we will make time at the end of this event for Q&A, because Chuck loves Q&A. So we're going to talk through your questions. If we don't get around to answering your question, or later today or next week you have a question around the bank consult, you can always email us. Many of the folks on this attendee list know how to get a hold of us, but you can also email sales@sksoft.com and we'll help you out there. And before I go into agenda, Chuck Schrader, will you introduce yourself to these fine folks?
Hi, I am Chuck Schrader. I am a senior solution architect at SK Global.
You sound wonderful, sir. So today's agenda, the topic of this session is called Inside the SK Global Bank Consult. If you are implementing the Treasury Automation Suite, or if you are interested in using SK Global products, many things that we do involve getting files to and from D365 or your Dynamics AX 2012 ERP. And so we talk to the banks all day, every day. So we've created many, many years of subject matter expertise in talking with your banks, working through formats and things like that. And so over time, we've kind of created this service that we call the SK Global Bank Consult. So the agenda today is we're going to talk through the goals of the bank consult. We're going to talk a little bit, just briefly, this is not going to be a technical session today, but we're going to talk a little bit about the Bank Communications Hub, or what some of you know as the File Hub, previously known as the File Hub, and just how we get files out of D365 to the bank and back and forth. And then we're going to introduce a resource. Some of you have heard of us reference the Bank Functional Matrix, but we're going to do an overview of kind of what we consider the foundational document for a successful bank consult. And you'll see here on the slide, we're actually providing this resource to you through a web link. So you can just go to sksoft.com/bank matrix. That will not take you to a Keanu Reeves Facebook page. It will take you directly to an SKSoft web page where you can download the bank matrix document that Chuck will talk through. And you'll see this link throughout the slide deck. So it'll will remind you of this plenty of times. But we'll do an overview of that resource that we're providing to you all. And then we're going to talk through how you actually talk with your banks, because we get a lot of customers that ask us about that. And like I said, we're on the phone with banks all day, every day. So we're going to kind of guide you through some of the best practices there. And then Chuck is actually going to go through bank formats module by module. We're going to talk through them as it relates to the global banking and treasury automation suite that we sell here at SKG. And then through this, we're going to revisit the bank matrix and obviously answer your questions. So throughout today's session, we've got about 30 or 40 minutes to cover a lot of content here. But throughout today's session, if you want to use the Zoom tool to post a question or use the chat and send me a question, then we'll gather those up and make sure that we cover them once we're done with the presentation. So there are really three things that make what we consider the SKG Bank Consult successful. So at a high level, we want to make sure that we're advocating for our customers who are implementing the SK Global Banking and Treasury Automation Suite and intend to integrate with their banks using D365 or even the older on-prem solution called AX 2012. We want to make sure that the communications with the bank is seamless and that all parties are aligned, whether that's the integration team at the bank, the SK Global implementer, the SI or the D365 implementation partner, and then of course the customer, the finance team that's actually using SK Global software on a regular basis, that all of us know how we're going to be communicating with the bank. And so the communications method is a key part of a successful bank consult. And then, of course, as many of you know, the way that we get information out of your ERP to the bank and process information coming from your bank back to your ERP is very reliant on the way that we get those instructions out or that we get the information back in. And a lot of that is done with supporting file types and formats. And so we want to talk through the bank formats and of course clarify the types of services that you need to have turned on with your bank to support the best correct formats to make this implementation as successful as possible. So that's the second goal of a successful bank consult. And then, as everyone knows, implementation timing. So we want to talk through how all of these parties are going to work together to make sure that the timing around the integration with your bank, getting files to and from your bank, and doing that in a timeline that's kind of friendly to the overall implementation, when you actually need to start paying vendors, testing files, moving things to production, what the bank's timing is, and so on. So really, those three goals are what SK Global comes into a bank consult hoping to achieve to make the bank consult service successful. So I'm going to pause there. Chuck, do you have any color commentary on the three goals of a bank consult?
Yeah, these goals that were listed here, the overall goal for us as well. We want to make sure things are right as early as possible in the project. So we at one time did not do kind of the bank consult process as much, and we'd get a lot of late requests for the formats because it was kind of an afterthought and not really thought of early in the project. So we introduced this process to try to get the formatting especially nailed down early so that there's not late surprises. And the last one there is key, knowing like surprises that are going to affect project timing. And the banks, a lot of times, if you choose a different format, now that's a different service, even if you had a service set up. And that might be a 6 or 12-week project for the bank on the bank side of things to set up that service. So I think we've got some of our clients being surprised on the project timing, thinking, oh, I already do business with Chase, and now we're going to do a different payment type. They should be able to add that. That's a 2-week thing or whatever. But you know, it might be, again, it might be a 6-week project for them to hook you up to a new platform on their end if it's a different platform than what you're currently using.
Yeah, and Chuck and the team, like we said, we're on the phone with banks and around the world all day, every day. And so we've kind of learned how to cut through a lot of conversation to kind of speak the bank's language and make sure that we're advocating for you all as well on the line, whether you're a partner or a customer implementing SKG. So I'm going to move to the Bank Communications Hub, again, previously known as File Hub. There's one more link here. Now this, you can obviously just email sales@sksoft.com and we can point you to this. If you are a partner on the line, you have access to our partner portal, and our documentation around the Bank Communications Hub is included there. So you don't necessarily need to write down this link. We're happy to provide the deck to you, but we have an FAQ that goes into detail about the Bank Communications Hub. But right now we're just going to spend a few minutes talking about how we technically get files in and out of D365. So Chuck, I'll leave that to you.
Yep. So if any of our customers are on this and they're on D365 already, then I'm sure they're familiar with this. But Bank Communication Hub is a required piece. It's a piece that we ship with our product. It does get installed on a server that you deploy. So it's either an Azure server or it's an on-prem server, but it's a web service that, as Ainsley says, it really is kind of our place to store files and or push things to the bank. We would normally recommend that you allow the SK software, the Treasury Automation software, to push and pull files from the bank versus manually uploading and downloading. If so, that's controlled in that same Bank Communication Hub. If you're on 2012 and attending this and thinking about moving to D365, this is probably a foreign concept. In 2012, you could, of course, 2012 had access to your networks and to your drive shares and things like that. So you could store files pretty much anywhere on your network. In D365, since it's all cloud-based, or it is for 99% of our customers, there's no access to physical storage on that box, so you need a place to store the physical files. So our Bank Communication Hub is that place to store the files. And again, if we're pushing things usually via SFTP to a bank or pulling things from the bank, this is the single place where that sending to and from a bank is done as well. Yeah, you want to move that one? Yeah. So the bank functional matrix, Ainsley mentioned that up front, and we'll walk through that a little bit. But we have come up with a document. It's very simple, a spreadsheet really, but it's really just to start the conversation and to keep it becomes kind of a conversation starting piece to kind of focus conversation with the bank in its first stages, and then it becomes a blueprint for exactly what we need to configure and what we need to, if we need to build anything in terms of formats. And it I've then later on in the process actually use that same process as that same document as a configuration tracker or a test tracker or something to that effect. So we ready by the point you're getting to configuration and testing, this document should be all filled out. And then I just normally use like a color coding scheme or something like that to use it as a tracking device as well. So initially, conversation with the bank to nail things down like the formats and the exact specifications. Later on, use it as a configuration and tracking tool. And I'll show you one that we got kind of some examples done up as to how that looks.
Yeah, and what I've learned from Chuck over time is that, this document always starts out blank, and then there are pieces where you're kind of adding to it. You don't have to feel like if you're working with SK Global and we send you the bank functional matrix that everything has to be filled out right away, because it's kind of a living, breathing document to move through the bank consult with, but it gives us a foundational reference piece. Many of you on the line If you're working with a partner on implementing SK Global, has probably seen something familiar or similar. And of course, when SK Global is implementing software through our delivery team, we use this bank functional matrix. I'll pitch one more time. If you just go to sksoft.com/bank matrix, you can get your own download of this document, and then you can remove all of the legal entity mumbo jumbo and fill it out yourself if you need to. Chuck, any other comments on this slide before we move on?
To cover that in a little more detail in a minute, so that's good for now.
Yep, so this is our last PowerPoint slide, and then we're going to jump into software and actually talk about formats by module. But one of the things that we, you know, again, we talk to banks all the time, every day. And so one of the things that we've learned through talking with customers and partners is that there are ways to kind of cut through a lot of barriers when talking with your bank. So we want to cover kind of who you should be talking with at your bank. Maybe there's somebody you need to communicate with right away to get the conversation going. How the conversation is going to go with your bank, the kinds of things that you need to cover off, of course, formats, and then timing. So Chuck, I'll give this to you now.
Okay, yep, sorry, I muted there for a minute. So, all right, yeah, I'll just, if you want to stop sharing, I can start sharing.
Now there we go.
So let me grab it back here. Am I sharing the right screen?
Looks like it. I see your format library.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I was just going to kind of walk through these one by one, and you know, things that we look for and things that if we know ahead of time can help with the process. I'll start kind of in the simplest ones. So Bankrec is probably the simplest one when it comes to the bank consult, and that's because 95+% of the banks that we deal with one of 2 or 3 file types. So BAI2 in North America is by far the most popular bank reconciliation format. And there's really, the nice thing is when banks mention BAI2, it's one of the few that really is a standard. As opposed to formats when we get in other modules, they'll use terms that are kind of meant to be standard, but the banks take a lot of liberties with it. With the BAI2 format in Bankrec, it's usually very, again, very standard as to how the banks use it. They do use the transaction types within it differently, but we have a mapper screen that kind of lets you work through that process. But BI2, again, in North America, outside North America, or if you have international presence, including North America, many times the banks will do a KMT 53 or MT 940. But again, those 3 formats probably cover 95+% of all the banks that we deal with. And when we deal with smaller regional banks, it's delimited and fixed field. The key with those is just that we get a specification from the bank as to exactly how this delimited field is going to look. Once we go to a delimited format, you can see there's a mapper that lights up. With the BI2, there's no mapper. Again, that is one of the few formats that we deal with across any of our modules that is truly standard. I just kind of keep walking through them here. Positive pay, it's probably the next most straightforward one. So when we deal with banks, a lot of times they will mention, you know, that yeah, their positive pay format is you know, this. Let's say we'll pick Bank of America. It's a 110 or 80 byte fixed file, or it's a cash pro format. When we're in the bank consult, if like Bank of America, you can see we got probably 15 or 20. If the bank mentions one that's not in the list, we can, and we do all the time, we can create additional formats and add them to the list. But we will a lot of times also ask the bank, do you still have the 316 or the 110, or, some of the more common formats that we know we've dealt with many times before. And if they do, a lot of times they can switch to that or have that one used instead, and it prevents having to develop a new format and add to the library. And the tried and true ones have just been through more paces, so there's less chance that we will develop something and there's something missing in the spec that's a required field or something like that. So positive pay, again, usually very straightforward from the bank to deal with. Usually involves them just giving us a specification, and once we get that specifications, someone comparing it to these formats behind the scenes. If you're trying to compare it yourself, it's pretty easy to hook these up to a check. To a bank account that does checks and print one out and compare it to a specifications. But again, we can kind of do that comparison for you as well, and compare whatever the bank is providing for specifications to one of the formats. And you can see for many of the banks, Bank of America, Citi, a lot of the more common banks, we got many formats all within the same bank. So if we're in that conversation up front, we try to make sure that we either have it, or if the bank has one that we already have, again, it can just reduce some cycles from the bank and our side and get you to the solution a little quicker. If we ever do have to develop a positive pay formats, those are, again, very straightforward. It's usually less than a couple week effort on our part to develop a brand new one from scratch. We'll move into Lockbox next. So ARES, so ARE Settlement. In older versions of our product, this was called Lockbox, and now we call it ARE Settlement for good reason, because it's used for a lot more than just Lockbox. This is one, unfortunately, they have the same name, BEI2, but this is not standard across banks. So a BEI2 from Citi, even a BEI2 from Citi for two different customers will likely not be the exact same layout. So we have a mapper on this that allows us to map to a bank format for the BEI2s and for the other for many of these others as well. There are a fairly limited number of these as well, unlike APEFT or positive pay. There's a pretty limited list of formats. BEI2, again, by far the most common inside the North America. CAMT 54, there's a couple versions of that. Very common outside of North America. So EDI, we have EDI formats. I will say the EDI, if the bank has another choice, we will typically try to steer away from the EDI 820s just because the information we see a lot of times in the EDI is very inconsistent in terms of how it's presented. So especially if you're getting EDIs directly from customers, the customers will use the fields slightly different. So we'll end up having to make multiple versions of the EDI even within one client implementation. So again, preference for us, BEI2 or CAMT. There's a couple nice things about them. One, again, for the BEI2, we have a mapper. The CAMT version 1 and version 2 is very fixed, but they have a very structured parent-child relationship. So payment to remit relationship is very structured within those files, so it makes it easier for us to know things with split payments and some other import processes that help, that if we know the parent and child belong together, the payment and the remit belong together, we can just present the workbench in a little better fashion for that. One other thing I'll mention, and if you go back to one of the previous sessions, I mentioned, I think the ARE settlement process is one of the more underutilized modules. And in many cases, it's underutilized by clients that already own the software. So if you buy our core suite, a lot of times, then AREO Settlement is included as one of the standard modules in that core suite. So in many cases, we have clients that own this already and just don't use it. But the thing I was going to mention, some of these formats people kind of think of as a true lockbox, but in many cases, almost all the major banks, they will be able to peel off the incoming, for instance, ACH or wire payments, anything that's being direct deposited to your bank account, and they will be able to present it in a, for lack of a better term, a lockbox-like format and a cash application format that we can read in. So again, a lot of our clients, they kind of go down the path of, hey, we don't have lockbox, so they kind of skip over this whole module. But if you're getting in a lot of electronic payments with or without a lockbox, the bank many times can peel off that information and put it in a AREO Settlement readable file for us to bring in. So that way we can automate that cash application for even those electronic payments. I know some of that information makes it through to the bank statement on incoming payments, and we do have some cash application functionality built into the bank process as well. But there is a lot of times information lost and a lot of structure lost when they do that, versus if the bank can present it in one of these types, again, the cash application can be a lot cleaner. So lockbox. Let's go to AP/EFT. Go through that one. So AP/EFT, probably the most amount of conversation in the bank consult process goes around your vendor payments and or direct debit types of formats. The direct debit ones are a little more concise, but the outbound vendor payments, again, probably the most complex. There's a couple things with that, and you'll see it on that bank functional matrix, is the types of, not only what banks do you do vendor payments with, but what types of payments. So we have, for instance, a USACH. So sometimes people will kind of go right to the USACH because they do ACH type of payments if they're in the US. But if you also do wire payments or also do other types of payments with that, then maybe that's not the best choice, because the XML formats, the ISO formats, will have the ACH and wires and outsourced checks and single-use accounts, a lot of times all in the same format. So again, when we're talking to the bank, we're trying to get into the details on this one a little more than most, because the types of payments you make will help us choose the right format to use. So if there's a single format that can support, wires and ACH, we'd much rather do that than have a separate format for wires and have a separate format for ACH. And it can also cut down on the number of files you have to send to the bank in terms of the costs there. You'll see some of these have the countries broken out. There are wire formats in here. There are international wire formats in here that can work very well for lots of international payments. There are certain destination countries, though, that have a lot different payment types even, or have a significantly different payment specifications than a normal international wire. So in the bank consult, we'll generally want to get an idea of what are the mix of destination countries that you're sending payments to, because that can influence the format or the format breakouts that we would recommend. Along with this is the return files coming back in. We have the, I don't have that one up, so the return files coming back in. We call these inbound files. So these are shared across direct debit and AP/EFT. So so vendor payments and the customer direct debits. The ISO formats, almost all of the ISO formats have this PSR type coming in. We have a couple specific flavors of it, but a lot of those have that ISO format coming in. But when on the AP payment side or the direct debit side, is part of really kind of all the same conversation is what banks are you dealing with, what for vendor payments, what types of payments specifically, and the destination countries can determine types of payments. Some countries just support other types of payments, different types of payments than another country. And then also the return files. With the return files, it's key to ask the bank the timing of those. So a lot of times you'll get files that come back very quickly, but they have very little information in. So there might be a file that comes back in 30 minutes that just says whether the file is good or not. There might be a second file that comes back within a 2-hour window that gives you transaction level status. And there might be a transaction that comes back 3 days later that says what if the destination, if something got rejected late. So typically it's a balance of what comes in soon enough to kind of allow our posting process to continue, but yet still have enough detail to preferably go but line by line and approve or reject individual payments within a payment journal. So on the inbound side, what is the file type and what is the timing? A lot of these, even if they have separate outbound types, can share the same inbound types as well. Let me see if we went through, I think we made through all. Ainsley, do we have questions coming in yet, or?
Not yet. Just a reminder to the group, you can submit a question in the Zoom QA tool right there, or send us a chat message.
So just a little bit of, I guess, background on the formats. So currently we have over 550 bank formats in our library. So there's a pretty good chance that we're going to have the format that your bank's required. The one thing I should have mentioned, and we always kind of mention as part of the sales or demo process, is that if we don't have your format, we will build it. So SK never charges to build a new format, never charges a development charge for that. Our licensing does, on the AP and direct debit side, it's based on the number of formats specific formats you need. But if your format, if you deal with the bank that we've never dealt with, or the bank is using a different platform or format than we've dealt with before, we can and do develop formats all the time. Likewise, if we have the format in here but don't have the payment specification that you need, we add new payment specifications all the time as well. If we need to develop a new format, again, it's a little longer window than positive pay, but it's still usually in the 2 to 3 week window that we can develop a new format from scratch based on the bank specification. So it's a fairly quick process, but it's still something we want to kind of figure out early in your implementation cycle so that we can make sure that we have the right pieces in place for you when you get to your testing and configuration cycles.
And one of the questions that I typically get asked in the beginning of a project is that development turnaround, the 2 to 3 weeks that we mentioned, is that 2 to 3 weeks from the start, or once the development group kind of has reviewed the spec document and submitted their questions and you've gone back and forth with questions and answers for the format?
Yep, so when we log a development request, one of the requirements is we have the specification in hand. So, I mean, the clock doesn't start, if you will, until we have a specification from the bank that includes the payment types that we want to do. Also, that counts on us getting somewhat timely answers back. So it's common that we would get, if we're developing a brand new format, that we would get to a certain part of the specifications and have a question. And again, there's time built into that 2 to 3 week window I just mentioned for us sending a question out and getting an answer from either you or your bank as to clarification on something. That's kind of built into that time frame. If for some reason there's a long delay in getting an answer back, or the question sits at the bank for a week, then of course that can kind of stretch out that timeline. But usually what I tell people in the implementation process, if we're doing something brand new with the bank, we're almost always going to have the format ready before the bank will have the platform ready. Usually, if the bank is spinning up a new service, it's going to be longer than a 2 or 3 week process.
Yeah, and we do have a few partners on the line. So just to clarify, typically the way that our solution is sold is that people are, for the most part, purchasing the license to our core banking and treasury automation suite, which gives you an unlocking key for these different modules that Chuck has been reviewing. The positive pay formats, the e-settlement and Bankrec formats are not really part of your license. You just get the ability to use those across those supported file types that Chuck was mentioning. Where the licensing comes into play is that we sell the core treasury automation suite with an included license for 2 formats. So when you're seeing kind of the EFT module with all of the little check boxes next to the formats in the library, is that we allow you to check 2 of those boxes or license 2 formats, and those formats are for either your outbound payments, your acknowledgement files. Are they also called return files, Chuck? I can never remember.
Right, inbound or acknowledgement or return, there's all kind of synonymous type of terms.
And similar for global customers that have the luxury of doing direct debit. We also have direct debit formats, and so those are included in that license count. So we still sell the 2 included formats in your core license for the Treasury Automation Suite, and then there's an additional cost to license more formats, or the use of those formats, basically checking more format boxes. But the development of the formats today and for the future and in the past, we have not passed on the development fee for format. So if we don't have it in the library, we develop it for you in that timing that Chuck mentioned, and we don't pass on the development fee to our customers.
Yeah, just a couple other quick comments about that is if the same format, for instance, USACH can be used for direct debits or for APEFT. So if you do license both modules and are using the same format on both sides of the fence, that still counts as just a single format. And likewise on the return file formats, those typically, again, if you are, for instance, sticking with ISO formats for Chase and an ISO format for Bank of America, then the return file is probably a PSR for both, a payment status report for both. So again, kind of choosing the right outbound can help you reduce the number of total number of formats that you need. For the people who have seen our had the software for a while, they may or may not be aware. Some of this was added a little bit late, but we currently we show now a breakdown of the formats in use, so you can actually drill in and see the formats. So if you're saying, hey, I don't know where these formats are all being used, you can go in and see by legal entity which formats are being used where. So let's say I don't mean to be using this NatWest one anymore. I can go in here and look and see where it's being used and maybe just disable it in there if I'm not using it. So that was not always in there to view payment format use. So for even the people who have used our software for a while, they might not be aware that that's there. I was going to go into that bank matrix. I just kind of wrap back up with that, Ainsley.
Yeah.
And then we can take any additional questions. So this bank functional matrix that Ainsley has mentioned a couple of times, we kind of saw a screenshot. It has, when we ship it, it usually has these first 3 tabs. So it has the blank tab, which is where you would start. It has an example starting, an example complete. I believe that the one we shipped today just has example start, but we could, you can just simply copy and paste and kind of go through. But we kind of go through the, what these tabs represent. But to get started, again, this is the blank one. To get started, really the most basic conversation is we need to know the banks you deal with and what modules, basically what functionality you plan on dealing with. For instance, in Wells Fargo, if I'm doing e-settlement and bank reconciliation and positive pay, but nothing else. Again, we need this to even have that first conversation with the bank. What are we doing with each one? So even if we don't know formats, even if we don't know anything else, we should be able to, with our clients, we feel they should be able to at least say, this is what we intend to do with these particular banks. So again, that's kind of the very starting point. And the other kind of key piece there is, and this we don't necessarily have to know right away, but at the bank, it'll sometimes make a difference on which platform you use. Some support a manual upload, some support a what they call host to host, which would for us is usually SFTP. But we want to know as early as possible, how do you intend for these files to get to the bank? We would always recommend the SFTP versus a manual upload. It just, there's less chance of a internal fraud risk when the file's not being manually handled, but it's a more secure path. But again, as long as we know this up front, we make sure even when we talk to the bank that either, if it's a specific platform, that manual uploads are allowed for that platform, or whether it's only host to host. So once we get this conversation, and then we're really starting to ask, now we're asking the bank for specifications. It says, what do these files look like? We're going to do positive pay with Wells Fargo. We need to have a positive pay specification. So the idea would be to transfer this, and we might even have multiple accounts with them, where some we do settlement and a different one we're doing positive pay. So we expect to kind of break it out like this over time, where we know what legal entities, again, the banks there now, there's multiple of them with different account numbers, but this account does, positive pay versus this account does e-settlement. So whether that's 1 or 50 or, legal entities, or 1 or 50, banks you're dealing with, we really need to kind of know this mix to know how to start configuring, even how to start having conversations with your bank. And you can see now that once we get this level of detail, then we start to have a blueprint for even, the configuration process. So as I mentioned earlier, I've taken this, once I've had this complete, I've taken this and started making copies of this tab and start using it to track the progress. So something as simple as just copying it and using a color coding system that says, I've not done this yet. So if I'm in the config stage of the project, I can use this to track the process of what I've got done and what I don't have done. When I get to the testing phase, same thing. I can kind of just start over with this, copy it again, mark it testing, and go through the same process. What have I tested? Have I actually tested the automated upload to the bank, or have I tested the manual upload, if that's what I'm going to do in this case? Maybe I sent something to the bank, but I haven't heard back yet that they've confirmed it. But and I've even done this, where I, testing UAT, testing, CRP or whatever, so I have multiple ones for the different rounds of testing. Again, as Ainsley said, it's a kind of a living, breathing document. We would hope that this page here gets stable early, so that we know what types of things we're doing. We're not introducing new services with the bank, throughout the project. We hope to get that nailed down pretty early, but again, using it as a tracking tool for both configuration and testing steps, we feel that's pretty useful as well. That's all I had from the spiel part, Ainsley. If we got more questions.
I'm gonna send a few questions your way. If you're on the line and anyone is listening in and has a question, you can post it to the Q&A tool. You can also send an email to myself or sales@sksoft.com, and we'll get you the questions. Typically somebody asks me if this is going to be recorded. So the session is being recorded, and as an attendee, you'll automatically get an email from Kelly with the link to the recording. And then the on-demand version of it will be available on the website here in probably a week or two. So for someone who is a partner on the line implementing SK Global, or a customer who's just starting to implement and kind of kicking off this whole bank consult, who do they start with at the bank when they send that first email or call with the bank? Who are they really trying to reach out to get on that initial phone call with the bank?
Usually you're starting out with a account type person, your account manager, that type of person, because they're going to want to know what services you want to do. They're basically going to want to know this start version of this. If it's a bank you already deal with and you have these services, you're still kind of starting with the same person, because they'll know this information. They'll know what service usage you have on what accounts. Um, Very soon after that, when you start to get into the platforms, and it's good to, even if you're setting up these calls with the bank, when you get to that next level, is to talk about the formats you're using and make sure like the technical or platform people on there. And a lot of times with the bank, for instance, like the ACH people, and the ISO people that handle the ISO formats, we've run into that many times where that's not the same group at the bank, even though they're both AP inbound or payments. There will be different groups at the bank. So always we're starting with somebody with again, it's typically your account manager, a title similar to that. When you get further in, you get into implementation specialists, and those tend to be kind of split between technical and functional. The technical people will be able to typically test when you start to do uploads and things and tell that the file got there. There are also people that can kind of give you a visual inspection. So a lot of times early in the process, if this communication's not wired up yet, you can still send files to the bank, and we always ask that, can we send you a file before this gets set up, and somebody give it a visual inspection, and the folks at the bank are usually very good at looking through those, and even without electronic verification, they can usually point out things if they're incorrect in your configuration.
And then one other question, is it better do we have a preference over building to a spec, a fresh spec, or using a format preference, something that's already in the library? When we get on the phone with the bank, what's our preference, Chuck?
Are there any bank people on the call? So, I will say that we'd always prefer to use an existing format. The reason I ask any bank people on the call, I think the bank specifications are notoriously kind of either incomplete or inaccurate. So there'll be a field that's not marked as required, but we'll send a test file to the bank, and then it'll be a required field. So things like that have been worked out in some of the existing formats. We will always, again, code something to the spec, but we found that we will code something to a spec, and then they will the bank will come back with some feedback, and we'll kind of point back to the spec it's not that way. Then they'll send us an addenda to the spec that now there's something that was newer that they've added that they didn't send us the first time. Again, those kind of cycles have been worked out in a lot of the existing formats, so we'd prefer existing formats.
Okay.
And yep.
I don't see any other questions. If you have any other commentary, we're all ears, Chuck.
No, I mean, just kind of expand on the last one. I mentioned the positive pay, like we will have 15 positive pay formats for Bank of America, and it wouldn't be uncommon for them to mention one that's not in that list. But if we ask, hey, we have all these formats, do you have other ones? They'll be, yeah, we have, and then they'll list them off. And, invariably we'll have one that matches that, but whoever was suggesting it in the first place just suggested one. And if we just kind of take that at its word versus asking a question back, again, it just introduces some additional cycles and additional risk into the project that just a follow-up question or two can avoid.
Okay. All right, well, we're at about 10 minutes till, so this is a friendly stopping point. I don't see any other questions. Most of you all know how to get a hold of us. If you go to sksoft.com/bank matrix, you can get your own copy of this bank functional matrix document, and you can email us at sales@sksoft.com, and we're waiting for your questions if you have them. So thank you, Chuck, for preparing with me for this, and thanks everybody for sharing your afternoon with us. Everybody have a good day. Thanks, Chuck.